So we move now to private members' business, and it's the motion read the government from Sinn Féin, read the government's response to Storm Éowyn, and I now call on Deputy Rose Conway-Walsh to move the motion.
And I move the motion. Minister, we are on the 19th day after Storm Éowyn, and there are still households and businesses without electricity and telecommunications and without water. And I do want to thank at the outset all of those field workers and their families for their dedication in carrying out this exhausting work day and night over the past 19 days. People who are already struggling with the cost of living and the cost of doing business are suffering the financial losses that they just cannot sustain, Minister. I'm not sure if you understand the hardship suffered by people who have paid the price for the failure of this government and successive governments to invest in the most vital infrastructure, electricity, water and communications. People have paid the price for the lack of effective coordinated emergency plan to deal with the aftermath of Storm Éowyn and the delayed government intervention. They should be compensated, and they must be compensated, Minister. This abject failure of government must be to put it right. Government funding must be provided for businesses, for sporting clubs, for voluntary organisations and community groups who have been impacted by the storm, as it was after Storm Babette. Many of these voluntary organisations and community groups were already struggling to keep going. They are still struggling to keep going. There must be a review of the core funding to these groups. They prove a vital lifeline in the aftermath of the storm. Businesses not only experience structural damage, they incur the loss of trade due to the temporary closures and not being able to operate fully because of not having phone lines and broadband. Those who are either not covered by insurance or the excess is such that they are unable to claim must be compensated. The 9% VAT for the hospitality sector must now be brought forward to be effective immediately. Some post offices in Mayo are still without broadband. They're running on a shoestring. Trying to make manual payments to ensure already vulnerable people have something in their pockets is taking its toll. What financial support, Minister, is going to be given to these post offices to ensure their sustainability? Where is AIR? Where are the mobile phone companies? Have they been called into the government offices to be told this is not good enough? What people in rural Ireland are rightly asking is, who is in charge? Where is the government? Where are the regulators? Where are those who made massive profits on the backs of ordinary people? The failure of the ESB to ensure the resilience of the network has to be put right. It must be put right for households by providing a goodwill payment to customers and by suspending the PSO levy and the standing charges for those without power. How did Éowyn think it would be possible to ensure water supply without generators? Are businesses going to be asked to pay a standing charge for water when they had no supply for days? Maybe we shouldn't be surprised when businesses in beautiful seaside towns like Newport are forced to pay for water treatment when there's no water treatment plant there. Who is in charge of people's right to water? Now, I want to commend the role of local community and regional radio stations, both in the forewarnings of the status red alert and the aftermath of Storm Éowyn. I just don't know where we would have been without them. In my case, Midwest Radio, covering County Mayo and the wider region, as well as the diaspora who anxiously waited for news as to what was happening to their families and whether their families were saved. Presenters kept going throughout the night with updates, with warnings and then the outages. That was apart from the company they provided for people living alone, living in fear of the worst storm ever. What is government going to do to acknowledge the vital role played by local, regional and community radio stations? Governments have paid lip service to these radio stations for over 30 years now. They have a public service remit. The Sound and Vision Fund is not fit for purpose. We need the purpose that we need them to serve. There must be multi-annual funding for news and current affairs. How can we justify giving $750 million to RTE and nothing for regional radios? The listenership figures reflect 63% for Midwest Radio in Mayo versus less than 20% coverage for our national broadcaster. This situation cannot be allowed to continue, and I ask that all TDs in this House to address this inequity in the immediate future. I also want to acknowledge the role played by Castlebar Community Radio and other community radios. In terms of business supports, the government have abdicated responsibility entirely. I have spoken to oyster farmers who have suffered losses in the hundreds of thousands. They must be supported to restock and repair damaged equipment. Farm businesses are wholly dependent on being productive to generate income. I've spoken regularly about the disgraceful acre scheme. We have to put a scheme in place for farmers, Minister.
Minister, Storm Éowyn was forecast and expected to be one of the most dangerous on record in Ireland, and it was. Warnings went out days in advance, and in turn, sports clubs and community sporting facilities right around the country, of all sizes and statures, prepared as best they could. Equipment was brought inside. Anything that could be locked down ahead of the storm was locked down and secured. They all did what they were supposed to do. The government also knew what was coming. There were ample warnings given. Despite the best efforts of clubs and facilities around the country, it was inevitable there would be damage. But government, you failed to prepare. No provision was made for sports clubs or community facilities in the fallout. The storm hit in earnest on January the 24th, and to date, this government has done nothing to assist clubs affected, bar administer a drawn-out survey of the damage to be collated by Sport Ireland. I contacted the Minister for Sport swiftly within days of the storm, when catastrophic damage to facilities like Longford Town Stadium or the Connacht GAA Aerodrome in County Mayo was surveyed and flagged. The response I received from the Minister on 31st of January stated, during previous extreme weather emergencies, such as Storm Babette in autumn 23, the government introduced an emergency relief scheme for community, voluntary and sporting bodies administered by the Red Cross. Whether such a model is followed this time will be a matter for discussion and decision by the government. 1 week later, at a time of dire straits for so many, here on the floor of the House last week on February the 6th, the Minister for Sports gave the same statement. The same statement that stated it will be a matter for discussion. A week further on, and despite all this discussion, no intervention has commenced and no work has been done to assist. In fact, the government's very own amendment to this motion issued this afternoon does not even mention sports or sports clubs. That's how much of a priority sports is to the government side of this House. You failed in your first test in government and you failed in your first test as ministers. Your inaction is failing the sports clubs and community facilities that are desperately seeking financial assistance to get themselves back on their feet, back open and serving their members and wider communities. Bishopsgate, home of the League of Ireland club Longford Town, has suffered significant damage following Storm Éowyn, with estimates of between 75 and 100,000 in damage to the club's grounds. In the very week that the League of Ireland's new season commences, this club has had to close their North Stand indefinitely. As well as of additional costs of chartered engineers, health and safety assessments and a decrease in capacity, in turn leading to a loss of revenue. The damage has also forced them to cancel one of their major annual fundraisers in their bank holiday car boot sale, an event that brought in thousands at a time for the club.
Thank you,
Minister, before I finish, and if you may, Cian Corla, I am urging on the government to immediately and without delay expand the assistance scheme to recognise what sports clubs need for. And the very fact that sports clubs wasn't mentioned in your amendment today is absolutely, frankly, deplorable. Thanks, Cian Corla.
And I'd like to start by commending the men and women of the emergency services, the ESB, Uisce Éireann crews and the council staff, all of whom worked tirelessly to deal with the aftermath of the most recent storm. I want to say a special word of thanks to those volunteers from the GAA and other sporting clubs, from community centres and men's and women's sheds and, all sorts of groups that came together and worked hard to set up community hubs to bring a small piece of relief to those communities who were left devastated by the aftermath of this storm. Thankfully, for most people impacted by any storm, the ordeal ends without too much delay, but for some it endures, and for many it endures for far too long. And while it's true to say that neither the government nor any state agency can predict the exact pathway and detail in advance, we know that extreme weather events are the inevitable result of climate change. You, as a government, cannot claim to have been surprised by an extreme weather event because you know that these weather events will occur. And now we come to the government's favourite part of every crisis, the lessons that have to be learned. We've heard it from your spokespersons again and again in the aftermath of any storm or extreme weather event. Lessons will be learned, they say. Maybe someone can explain why the lessons learned from Storm Babette were not incorporated into the response to Storm Éowyn. The Humanitarian Assistance Scheme should include businesses, sporting clubs and voluntary organisations, as well as community groups impacted by the storm. Minister, I would urge you to support this motion and send an important message to those communities who feel like they've been forgotten by your government. People left for days and weeks with no connectivity, completely cut off. People like Emma Ward, who I've spoken about previously. Emma needs power for her wheelchair. She said that she never felt so forgotten in all her life as she waited and she waited. She could not use her power wheelchair. She couldn't get to college. It effectively meant she was cut off completely. And she said to your government directly, she never felt so forgotten in all her life. And for a young woman with a disability, and you well know, Minister, how young people, in particular with disabilities, are treated by your government and this state. So you can imagine how she felt to say she had never felt so forgotten in all of her life.
Deputy
Today, people in my constituency in Roscommon and Galway are day 19 without electricity, and of course in some cases that means no heating in their homes and no water either. 19 days. I want to take this opportunity while I have it, following on from the statements that we made last week, just to raise a number of issues that continue to be issues, particularly for businesses, for farmers and for customers that have been affected by the power outages. There continues to be confusion in relation to supports for businesses. I contacted the Minister for Enterprise and his department. I got a reply back, and the second point on that reply was pointing to the Humanitarian Assistance Scheme. Then that section told me that they weren't providing supports to businesses. And now I've got a further reply from the Department of Enterprise telling me and businesses about insurance and what insurance does, which of course they are more than aware of that. The department's reply goes on to tell me that the programme for government includes a commitment to an extreme weather event assistance scheme, and that this will be looked at to be delivered within the time frame of the current government, and that it is still to be fully worked through. Now, this is of no benefit, nor could I hand it to any business in my constituency that are without support. Something needs to be put in place for businesses, something specific for businesses, and it should have been done a week and a half ago. In relation to farmers, I rang the department phone line, the HAS phone line, and I was told sheds for farmers are covered. I made that information available to a number of farmers, and then it became apparent they weren't actually covered after all. And this is what happens, you see, when the Dáil didn't sit as it should have sat. There is misinformation, there is confusion, and nobody knows what's what. And there are supports that are needed that are not put in place 19 days later, which is not good enough. I heard from a farmer yesterday, he spent €6,000 repairing a shed after the last storm, and he does not have that 6,000 to put in again. I want to make two final points. The insurance companies need to be taken to task by this government, and they need to be told that people should not have their premiums increase next year where they make a claim through no fault of their own. And lastly, and most importantly, storms are storms, they're not the fault of the ESB, but the ESB have to take responsibility for their failure to have any kind of resilience in the electricity infrastructure, and they must take responsibility for trees falling on power lines. It is their job and their responsibility to secure their power lines. They failed to do that, and it has caused devastation. The ESB need to play their part. They need to provide the goodwill payment, they need to suspend the standing charges and the PSO levy, and that is the very, very least that the CEO of the ESB should do. And I think his attitude to date is really, really disappointing, and it has caused great anger amongst those affected.
Deputy Dáil.
First of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the ESB workers who risked their lives not only after recent Storm Éowyn, but after the snow severe weather alert also. But 18 days later, for many, power has not yet been restored, and for others the power returned only to go back out again. Although Storm Éowyn was severe, power cuts are not unique to this storm, and despite paying the highest electricity prices in Europe, many people are regularly left without power. And I have an email which I received from someone in the Brosna area of County Kerry who said that she can count at least 10 power outages since the 26th of July 2024, and along with this there was another 6 planned outages. So it's absolutely critical, she says, that the ESB provide a genuine explanation because there's financial implications. She had to throw away food that had been spoiled, they were cold, they were left without heating, and many of these letters came to my office. In Brosna, in her area, there have been at least 22 power cuts in the last year. 6 were planned, the remainder were unplanned, and 19 of these were unrelated to Storm Éowyn. This is just the regular level of service that constituencies have unfortunately come to expect. They have told me that they've been forced to live off-grid at their own considerable expense, and many people, including myself then, were shocked by the comments from some people in the ESB who said that customers would have to pay for upgrades or repairs, warning that inevitable price increases would come on top of already extortionate bills. Are the ESB trying to pull a fast one here? Because for years the energy regulator has warned the ESB that unless they got their act together, repeated and prolonged power outages were inevitable. In 2023, the CRU report was highly critical of the efforts up to that point, pointing out that they're way behind targets, significant improvement was needed. Similarly, the government's own 2019 sectoral adaptation plan warned of the dangers that lay ahead, highlighted the need for improvements to make the network more resilient, and called specific attention to the risks of falling trees. Despite this, the government and the ESB have been asleep at the wheel. As a result, communities have been left what they feel abandoned. Have they no regard for the havoc that the outages wreak in people's lives? And in advance of the storm, I had arranged for a meeting with the ESB in Brosna to address the power cuts, but it was cancelled in anticipation of the storm. Fair enough. But people deserve answers. The ESB owe the people of Brosna and the communities like them a full explanation as to why their lives are repeatedly brought to a standstill. So I'm asking the ESB to hold the meeting, compensate customers who had loss of service, and as well as additional costs occurred to find a backup source of power. Also, the PSO levy and the standing charge must be suspended during any power cuts. It's the least the government can do.
Thank you. Deputy Martin Kenny.
Thank you, Concordia. Minister, as you know, in County Leitrim we have a very large volume of forestry. We probably have the highest amount of forestry in the country per head of population, or for the land area that we have. And that has brought huge devastation when the power lines all came down as they went through the forests. And the main issue that we have is that the trees are planted too close to the lines. And it's as simple as that. Now, ESB Networks has a job to do to protect critical infrastructure, and they have not done that. And that has been the key failing of this entire saga. Because we've seen it in the last storm and we see it again in this one. There's hundreds of trees on top of the lines and hundreds of trees on top of those trees. And it takes days, and in this case weeks. Thankfully, the vast majority of people have their power back now at this stage. But there has to be an absolute emphasis on ensuring that something is done. Not that something is done, but that there is a clear policy to protect those power lines, to cut the trees back from them, because the next storm will come, we'll be in the same problem again. And that has to happen. Government have to do that. There's no other way out of that. The other issue I want to raise is in regard to the Humanitarian Assistance Scheme. We have hundreds of people onto my office that have put in forms, have got no money yet, don't know where they stand. It's very, very ad hoc and a complete mess of a scheme, Minister. And there needs to be a revamp of that scheme to ensure that it actually does do what it's supposed to do. When somebody has their freezer full of food and the food has all gone to waste, that it will pay for it. They've been told, no, it won't pay for it. Then people told, get your insurance. They go and they write to their insurance company or contact their insurance company. Some insurance company says, yes, it will cover it. But one woman was on to our office. They said it was going to cost €800 for the food, but there'd be €600 a year going on to their extra on their insurance for the next 3 years because they lose their no claims bonus in effect because of it. You also, of course, have issues because of the excess on insurance that a lot of businesses particularly have. So we have businesses out there that are trying to claim insurance for the loss of goods and damages that they've had, and they find that there's an excess there that they have to, first of all, try and work with. Minister, we need some kind of a scheme put in place to ensure that people can be either compensated. I think that the people that have to compensate them should first of all be the ESB. That any time your power goes out for more than 4 or 5 days or something, that every household should get a payment of €100 a day for every day it's out. It would put a bit of a spark in them to ensure that people weren't out for too long. And when it comes to businesses, they certainly should be getting compensated. I spoke to a business last week who's a small business in rural Ireland that do precast concrete, haven't been able to do anything for the past 3 weeks almost, and it will probably be even longer before they can get back to work. Those small businesses, restaurants, hotels, all of them have been suffered greatly because of this mess that is in place, mainly because the ESB has not protected their critical infrastructure, their lines where they go through forests. And that needs to change, Minister. But we also need to have a government that will ensure that people are adequately compensated and looked after in these circumstances. Many, many old people, particularly, and people with disabilities, were hugely stressed because of the situation that they couldn't get any power for weeks and weeks on end. We cannot see a repeat of this in the future.
Thank you, Deputy.
Parts of Connemara had serious telecommunications issues in November, with certain areas without phone signal for up to 3 weeks. And now again, these exact same people, Minister, are facing the exact same issues. And many have been told that they won't get connectivity for another 6 weeks, despite us running into the 3rd week of the storm aftermath. Some are being told by their private providers that they have absolutely no update for them. And I have to say, Minister, for those people who have never been impacted by that, it mightn't appear as serious an issue as it actually is. Because I had one woman contact me who has a heart condition, who needs to monitor and report to the hospital every single night. Without broadband, she isn't able to do that. And that could cause her, obviously, really, really serious issues. And again, Minister, where is the prioritisation for our vulnerable customers? Where's the database for our vulnerable customers, and what is being done about that? You claimed here tonight, Minister, that the needs of the most vulnerable were prioritised. Well, it clearly hasn't been if there's a woman in that situation. It wasn't either for the woman that contacted me on Saturday, that I met on Saturday, who was 13 days without electricity and who relies on an oxygen machine. Where's the prioritisation there? The lack of broadband services also impacts on the services that the Post Office can provide, particularly in relation to the banking services that they usually provide. And that means that people can't lodge money to meet their direct debits or their mortgage payments. And this banking service is a really great service for people, particularly in our more rural areas. But what's being done to rectify that? It's also an issue in terms of withdrawals and access to cash. And these are older people who really rely on that access to cash, and they just don't have it. Businesses in rural areas are far more, and you'll know this, than simply a business. They provide a service that often the state doesn't provide, and they also have a community aspect to them. And a lot of them operated as hubs during this crisis, even though they didn't have the official title of a hub, with locals coming to them, especially when they didn't have a phone service, just to find out what was going on. And one of the businesses that contacted me actually travelled across the country to access a generator. They travelled to Kildare because they're in a very, very rural area, and without that business operating, there's nothing in the village. But without broadband, they weren't able to use their pumps for petrol and diesel. So if they can't provide the services without the broadband, and if therefore people have to travel a significant distance, but they can't access petrol or diesel, then what in the name of God are they supposed to do? The businesses have said that they fully understand that the initial need has to be with families, but they're surprised at this stage that they've heard nothing. And one small business told me that they've lost €18,000. Another told me that they lost €15,000, yet they haven't heard a whisper from government as to what supports are available. So maybe the Minister in his closing remarks can speak to that. In terms of public safety, I would like to say that across Connemara we still have telecommunication poles that are just simply hanging and broken in half. Trees that are keeping poles and loose cabling is on the ground, which just simply is not safe. Some of this is still the case since Storm Dara, and Ministers, we do need to do better, and people expect us to do better. And I'd just like to comment on one of the remarks, Minister, that you made tonight. You said it has been claimed that there was a lack of a coordinated plan for dealing with Storm Éowyn, and I would like to put on the record that this was not the case. But simply putting something on the record doesn't mean that it wasn't the case. We had areas that could not access 999 emergency calls for over a week. So we need to get to the bottom of that. We need to make sure that we have an approach to this and that we can deal with this so that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you, Deputy. We move now to Deputy Anne Graves.
As this is my first time to speak, I would like to take the opportunity to thank firstly my family for their ongoing support, my daughter Christine, my sons Paul and David, and my grandson Noah, and Mary and Alana, and remembering my husband who passed away last year, who was my strongest supporter. I'd also like to thank the people in Fingal East who came out to vote for me and put their trust in me, and I intend representing them to the best of my ability. And finally, my Republican family, the volunteers, comrades and friends who work their socks off in all weathers, Míle buíochas. So when Storm Éowyn hit the country, we had 85 trees down across Fingal. And once the red weather warning was lifted, we had all the support services, Fingal County Council, Dublin Fire Brigade, the ESB, Uisce Éowyn out doing their job and trying to do it clear up. However, the effects were felt for days afterwards in terms of power and connectivity. So I've heard from a mother who had a child dependent on a hoist and a feeding tube. The power in their home in Swords was out for 5 days. Close by, an elderly man in his 90s was living alone without supports, and he was in the same situation with no connection to the outside world. So the most vulnerable people were hit the worst. Many other people contacted me where they couldn't contact relatives and friends across the country. They were tempted to brave the elements and try and go and visit them, you know, because they couldn't get in touch by phone or by any other means. A local hotel allowed residents in to use their facilities, showers, etc. But those with mobility issues couldn't avail of that because, once again, the most vulnerable people were affected. Government needs to step up to protect the lives and well-being of people by putting in place preventative measures. Investment in capital infrastructure is an absolute must. Well before the storm, delivery of power has already failed. So in my constituency in Donabate, for example, residents face regular loss of electricity through power outages. In fact, they had a power cut on Christmas Day this year. Increased development without the necessary infrastructure and amenities as a prerequisite is a recipe for ongoing problems. With growing incidences of storms, we're looking at continued chaos in the aftermath unless there's real investment in capital infrastructure. Prevention is always better than cure. We also need to look at a review of the tree management policies. I was out with residents in Malahide following the storm, where a tree had come down on one side of their road and lucky enough landed on the far side of the road. But they had flagged it as problematic with their local council. Based on the fact that trees were too big for an estate. Now, nobody wants the removal of healthy trees unnecessarily, you know, but we need to be looking at protecting the power lines as well as protecting the people who, you know, that's a priority. The ESB made 890 million in profit last year. It's shameful that people who have suffered would be expected to pay.
Deputy.
Yeah.
Time is up.
So, yeah, just to say, investment has been lacking under successive government, and we need it now. Thank you.
And Deputy, if I may just say before you start, Deputy O'Hara, sincere sympathy on the loss of your partner, and in order to get elected so soon afterwards, well done.
Thank you.
Deputy O'Hara.
I'm very conscious that today, on day 19, some people in my constituency remain without electricity. And I don't think anybody can comprehend the difficulty of going without power for 2.5 weeks unless you actually experience it yourself. It's desperately difficult for people who faced extended periods without electricity, and that needs to be recognised and compensated for by the state. Many in my constituency are absolutely furious, and rightly so, that they are receiving bills, including the PSO and standing charges, when they went without electricity for extended periods, in many cases up to 2 weeks or more. It's unacceptable to charge people who are left without electricity, and these charges must be suspended for the period people were without power. That's the bare minimum that people should expect. But furthermore, you must ensure that the ESB provides a goodwill payment to customers based on the length of time they were without power. The ESB made profits of €898 million last year. This is the very least that should be done to compensate those affected. And in that context, the suggestion by the ESB Chief Executive that the costs of repairing the electricity network may be borne by customers through increased bills are totally unacceptable, and that should be made very, very clear by government. In addition, ESB workers and all of those who responded to the storm, including Irish Water, Council, emergency service workers and so on, must be acknowledged too. The lack of clarity on the humanitarian assistance scheme and the low payments made so far have been very disappointing, given the additional costs that people faced. Information on the scheme and what is covered is only coming out in dribs and drabs, and it's not fair on people affected who could be missing out on what they're entitled to. I've been contacted by a number of businesses and clubs in my constituency who've lost tens of thousands of euros in stock or in damage to their facilities, and insurance will not cover it all or any of it in some cases. And we know how difficult it is for businesses, clubs, community organisations at the moment with increased costs and so on, and losses like this really threaten their future. The response I've received from parliamentary questions is that you hope that insurance would cover losses and you will examine it, but that isn't good enough. These organisations desperately need support, and you need to recognise that and provide for that. And the same goes for farmers as well. Many farmers have had damage to sheds, machinery and so on. They can't be forgotten either. The Minister mentioned the extreme weather assistance scheme. I mean, we're 19 days on. It's time to wake up and bring forward a scheme for farmers and for businesses and clubs.
Minister, firstly I want to express my sincere gratitude to the staff of our local authorities, the hard-working staff of the ESB and the emergency services who gave so much during and after Storm Éowyn. Many of these people are still cleaning up after the storm. In Meath West, community hubs played a crucial role providing support to many. They ensured that many people in Meath without power could charge their phones, work from the hub, shower and ensure people had a warm building they could go to. This is why community centres and GAA clubs should be provided with generator should they be the ones without power in the future. A woman not too far from where I live with multiple sclerosis relies on a hoist to lift her in and out of bed. She couldn't access a community hub and she and her family had to depend on someone to lend her a generator to power the essentials for her, including charging her electric wheelchair and powering her hoist. Cases like this weren't isolated cases. The government need to ensure that generators are on hand to distribute to those most in need, if and when needed. People who invested in forestry and had large areas flattened, and what supports are in place for them. Some kind of a fund for SMEs who one small IT business beside myself with 15 employees told me they were losing 15,000 a week. And I have to speak about the government's delayed response. Many businesses and community groups are still struggling and need support. It's unacceptable that people were left without power for so long and the government did not step in with adequate help. Today, 19 days later, some people still without power. We need a serious commitment from you all, ensuring that when disaster strikes, we have the resources and the infrastructure in place to protect our communities. And if we were proactive instead of reactive, many of these power outages could have been prevented. If regular inspections and maintenance of roadside trees took place, many farmers and constituents who have roadside trees cannot afford the cost to have them removed. And other trees overhanging electrical and phone wires right across the land. And in the future, look at where phone wires could be undergrounded. Simple measures like ensuring that Ishgearden has generators at treatment plants and pumping stations are crucial. Their lack of forward planning left key water infrastructure without backup generation capacity after Storm Éowyn. I urge you to take immediate action, provide generators for the civil defence to distribute to vulnerable individuals, offer financial support to businesses and community organisations affected by the storm, and ensure that essential services like water treatment plants have the backup they need to operate during storm crisis. Thank you.
Minister, it is during times such as storms like these that we really see the value of public services, and especially our frontline public servants, people from the ESB, from our local authorities, from our emergency services, from Garda Síochána, coming out in all weather in very, very difficult circumstances to ensure that people were safe, to ensure that people were looked after and to ensure that people were reconnected. We owe them a huge debt of gratitude. The storm wreaked havoc right across the state, and in many areas we are still facing a situation where people are without energy, and that undoubtedly is a very worrying set of circumstances and requires consideration. Cork City was not probably one of the worst affected areas, but nonetheless there was damage done. And one of the causes of frustration, and the reason I suppose I'm raising this with you, Minister, is that while there is schemes available for householders, as of yet there is nothing for community groups, sports clubs and businesses. and I think that's a huge problem. I want to give two examples of sports clubs. These are clubs that are, run entirely on a voluntary basis, and a huge effort goes into fundraising to ensure that jerseys and insurance is paid and footballs and so on. When a thing like this happens, it hugely sets back a club. Everton Football Club saw about €12,500 worth of damage done. Fencing, dugouts, goals, all upended. Their nearby neighbours, Ballyfian GA, playing at the old Redmonds GA pitch, saw fencing, goalposts, railings, all upended. This is a huge cost to them that will set them back significantly. Clubs that are growing and developing. I don't think it's right that there's no scheme available for them. I don't think it's fair, and I'm urging you to open up a scheme for those sports clubs, community groups and businesses who have lost money or who have incurred significant cost because of this very severe storm.
Chuck the Doherty.
In my own constituency of Donegal, obviously there was a lot of damage, and the biggest damage was that to the life of Casper Dudek, who was a 20-year-old who was returning home from work and was killed as a result of the storm. And I just want to think about him today, his family, his friends, such a young life. And we talk about the impacts of this storm, which has had across the entire state, but the impact for that family will be forever and long lasting. I do want to show my gratitude to the staff of the ESB who was in regular contact with me during that time and pulled out all the stops to get the power back on in the home so that they could have a wake and grieve it took a while, but they were able to achieve that. Minister, like any other deputy, we've seen a huge, obviously, devastation in our communities, but we also seen the best of our communities that responded, the voluntary and community effort right across my own county, but also across the state. Those who responded to the elderly, those who responded in terms of clearing roads, and also the staff of our state organisations, our council, our Ishgear and our ESB, all who went above and beyond to get people up and back at it. Community and sporting groups opened up their facilities, and many of them, as Deputy O'Leary has mentioned and others have mentioned, had their own facilities damaged. Businesses opened up their premises to allow people to recharge batteries. In some cases, hotels for hot showers offered free beds. Their own premises, in some cases, has been damaged, and no support has been offered to any of those sporting organisations, community groups, or indeed our businesses. When I looked at the hubs that came out, that was announced by government, maybe a week after, it was actually the community groups that were already doing the stuff from day one that was just collated in a piece of paper. And I just thought, these are the real heroes in our community, and they do need to be respected. So I echo the calls which is in this motion today to bring forward a scheme to allow those to be assisted in those sectors as well. Our local radio stations, without them, many wouldn't know how you could get connected, how you could get the information, how you could get maybe the battery for the hoist for the child who has a disability recharged, or where you could have a safe haven. And my own county had a particular challenging time because there was a warning issued for people in mobile homes to leave their mobile homes. But, Minister, as you know, as a result of the defective concrete block scandal, that many of my constituents are in mobile homes because their houses are less safe than a mobile home in the storm. And I was very concerned for many of them, and indeed some mobile homes have been very, very significantly damaged. We had 87,000 homes, farms and businesses in Donegal, practically the entire county, without power after the storm, and 700 were still left without power at the weekend. It was actually only yesterday that the ESB were able to confirm that all homes have now been restored with power. That's 16 days after the storm. One case, and there's many of them, but one case which impacted on me was a family of an 85-year-old who was in contact with my office. There was no family nearby where this person lived. He was alone without power for 10 days. He was an 85-year-old. He was in poor health, having no light, no heat, no warm water for 10 days. It is simply unacceptable. He was too frail to make it to any of the hubs, and despite living only on a pension, he had to find money to pay for a room in a nearby hotel after the 10th day. A school in Donegal town with 30 children were left without electricity for over a week. That's a full week of parents having to make alternative arrangements and likely time off work. And action needs to be taken by government to ensure that this doesn't happen again. The government's response to the storm failed rural Ireland. I think that's fair. There was a scrambling after the fact, but we had generators in the wrong place. We didn't have a list of hubs. We didn't know where essential services or people could go for essential services, and it didn't come out of the blue. We know that there's been warnings after warnings from the Commission of Regulation of Utilities have called on ESB networks. They've called them out for unacceptable continued poor performance levels when it comes to ensuring reliability of supply. So this has been going on for years, despite the fact that ESB have been making massive eye-watering profits. And what we do need to see from ESB now is goodwill payments for those who have been affected, and also the waiving of the standing charges. But it's not just ESB. There's people in my county, Minister, that don't have internet connection still today. These are businesses and residents alike. And people are asking me on the phone and saying, in one case, somebody who relocated to the county thought that they could do remote living, working from home, and they're re-questioning the whole issue. And there's many more other questioning whether, saying to me, if the government come trying to take my fireplace off me or stove off me, tell them they'll have another thing coming, because they've left us without heat and without electricity for nearly 16 days. So there is a lot to, the old saying from government is lessons must be learned, but in this case the lesson should have been learned. This isn't the first storm we've had. The preparation should have been there. There wasn't an effective plan, and unfortunately government were caught out in a bad way in this way, and people were let down as a result of it.